A couple of years ago, my wife Kathy and I did some street interviews on a sunny afternoon in Seattle. It does happen now and then. And we asked a very basic question. How do you define right and wrong? And how do you determine the difference? We found no shortage of people who were willing to give us an answer on camera and provide permission for us to share their comments with others. Well, after over an hour of nearly back-to-back interviews, we did not find a single individual who made reference to the Bible or to the God of the Bible. Not one. What did we find? Well, I'd like you to see for yourself.
Right and wrong. That's a tough one. Very basic, but very tough. Right, I think it depends on what your background is, what your moral set is. For me, it would be quite different than for someone else. It's the way you've been raised. It's the ethical standards that you've been held to or choose to hold yourself to. So I think it's extremely variable. Can't tell you.
You know, that's a good question. There's a lot of debates. If everyone knew what that definition was, I don't think there'd be as many political protests, you know, pro-choice, pro-life, all that good stuff. So I'm really not in a position to say what is right or wrong. I think right and wrong is a matter of perspective, really. Like, yeah, it's all perspective, really.
Okay. I guess this isn't something I ever really explicitly think about. Usually I just go with my feelings.
Yeah, and I think context matters too. I don't think there's any definitive right or wrong for anything. It really depends on the situation.
All right, so right is that which agrees with the person or group. Wrong is that which does not.
It sounds like such an easy question, but it's really not. This idea of what is right and what is wrong. I don't know. I want to say there's really nothing that's right and wrong because anything could be argued as to be right just as well as it could be argued to be wrong. So I think people know what is inherently right or wrong within their own immediate reality. So in the general sense, it's hard to decipher. We have to, though. If we didn't, it'd just be chaos. Then again, it does cause a lot of chaos, too. So how would I define right or wrong? I guess I wouldn't define it. I'd let somebody else define it for themselves. So.
Going to a Jesuit school, going to Seattle University, they would probably want me to answer this well. But I'm just going to answer it how I think I should. I would say doing what is right would be measuring the impact it has on others. And if something goes too far to harming others, I believe that would be considered wrong. And I want to keep it broad, but yeah.
I think it depends on what you personally believe. I think if you go to different neighborhoods across America, they'll have completely different answers. So I think it has to do with your morals and your upbringing, but basically right is what you feel good about and wrong is things you know you shouldn't do.
It's basically just a stigmatic thing. You know, it's your social environment. It's right and wrong. Like she said, it's a neighborhood thing.
right and wrong is basically a simple definition. If you feel what you are doing in your body, it tingles, you have to listen to your body. If it feels wrong, then it's wrong. If it's what you know in terms of the things that people told you that are right or wrong, you know what those things are wrong. But I think generally it comes down to sort of how your body reacts and what it goes through when you're undertaking that decision to do something. And if your body tells you it's wrong, then it's wrong.
Right, maybe it's something that can
be good for you and for other people without annoying or bugging anyone. So if it's good for you and it's not bad for others, this is right.
I agree. Knowing that we come from Italy, and so we know that many things connected to the church are not always the best ones for all the population or all the people in, for example, in Italy.
Yes, like sacred doesn't mean it's right. So it can be sacred for some people, but not for others.
Okay, that's all.
I cannot come up with a general definition of how I define what's right or wrong. There are questions of philosophy, for instance, that are beyond my ability by quite a bit, actually.
So how do I define right and wrong? I really think that is a seriously individual question. And, well, I got to think about this quote that I read from Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. What is right and what is wrong? Need we ask anyone to tell us these things? Not knowing, it's okay. It's not really that important to know. You go back to the question of right and wrong and spirituality and morals, and these things happen, golly, from so many doggone influences that it's really up to one's individual responsibility to define that and, more importantly, to live that. Did that make any sense?
I believe it was Arnold Toynbee who said that great civilizations don't die of murder. They die of suicide from within. In my own lifetime, there has been a huge shift in the ideas held by the general American public as to the basis of right and wrong. I have no doubt that if I had gone out on the street in the 1950s to ask people the same question that Kathy and I asked a couple of years ago, I have no doubt that many people would have made reference to the Bible, or at least to the Ten Commandments, or quoted Jesus' words, "Love thy neighbor as thyself." Is morality based on objective, universal truth? Truth that's provided for humans by a higher lawgiver? I believe it is, and yes, there are still many in this country who hold to this belief, but it seems such people are fewer and fewer. Why is this? What has happened? And more importantly, is there anything that can be done about the situation? And let me say that this has everything to do with holistic education. For Comenius and John Milton and Jonathan Edwards and Webster, education was a pursuit of truth. But it was not the kind of truth pursuit that my wife and I found on the streets of Seattle. In the formative years of the United States, the Bible played a central role in the culture at large. It was not on the sideline, but it was central to the thinking of people on the street. The Bible didn't have an ornamental role like it had in 1962 when devotional Bible reading in public schools was outlawed by the Supreme Court, but the Bible had an intrinsic role. I've quoted Webster before in this course, and I'd like to quote him again because what he said really bears repeating. Webster, the father of American scholarship and education, said education was useless without the Bible. Now that's being pretty blunt about it. His American Dictionary of 1828 contained more biblical definitions than any other reference volume of his day, and probably since. In the preface, Webster wrote, "In my view, the Christian religion is the most important and one of the first things in which all children under a free government ought to be instructed. No truth is more evident, to my mind, than that the Christian religion must be the basis of any government intended to secure the rights and privileges of a free people." In the March 1788 issue of the American Magazine, Webster wrote, "The education of youth should be watched with the most scrupulous attention. Education, in a great measure, forms the moral characters of men, and morals are the basis of government." He went on to say it is much easier to introduce and establish an effectual system for preserving morals than to correct by penal statutes the ill effects of a bad system. Webster referred to the Bible as that book which the benevolent Creator has furnished for the express purpose of guiding human reason in the path of safety, and the only book which can remedy or essentially mitigate the evils of a licentious world. In a letter to David McClure written on October 25th, 1836, Webster said, "Any system of education which limits instruction to the arts and sciences and rejects the aids of religion in forming the character of citizens is essentially defective." And when he says the aids of religion, he's specifically referring to Christianity. And if Webster were alive today, I have no doubt about what his assessment would be of the mainstream American education. I'm sure he would be blunt about it too. He would say that it is essentially defective. In fact, I suspect he would say more than defective, some of it is actually destructive. Now, the Comenius-Webster pursuit of truth involved using God's Word and God's works like two sights on a rifle. And those two sights, aligned by the reasoned eye of a person supporting the barrel, provided an intelligent way to hit marks. But this really is an old-fashioned view of truth, and many people feel it's an outmoded view of education. And I believe this is much to our collective detriment. No doubt the motto, "Truth for Christ and the Church," was put on the Harvard crest to keep the aim of education in sight. It helped them to hit the mark. Now, to say that Harvard got disoriented somewhere along the way is really an understatement. Not only has the target been moved, but the sights have been removed from the barrel. Yet, not only at Harvard, the University of Chicago has a tradition of giving freshmen a lecture every year. It's called The Aims of Education. When Professor John Mearsheimer gave the Aims of Education address to the class of 2001, he said this: "Not only is there a powerful imperative at Chicago to stay away from teaching the truth, that is, the truth, but the university also makes little effort to provide you with moral guidance. Indeed, it is a remarkably amoral institution." I would say the same thing, by the way, about all other major colleges and universities in this country. And he went on to say the importance of religion at elite educational institutions like Chicago diminished greatly in the first decades of the 20th century. And he added, Moreover, I would bet that you will take few classes here at Chicago where you discuss ethics or morality in any detail, mainly because those kinds of courses do not exist. Professor Mearsheimer called the University of Chicago a remarkably amoral institution. But let's think about this. Is it really possible for an institution that offers no classes dealing with morality and ethics to be an amoral university? I submit to you that there never has been, nor will there ever be, an amoral university or an amoral approach to any subject, no matter what grade level, even math. From civil engineering to business to art to psychology to biology, even if no teacher specifically mentions the word morality in class and no teacher specifically talks about ethics, the fact is every subject has morality as an integral part of it. And this is true from the first day of kindergarten all through the last day of graduate school. You see, Professor Mearsheimer was propagating the great premise of secularism, which says it's possible to be neutral about morality, and that secularized education can be amoral, but it simply can't be. That's because, as I mentioned in session 8, secularism, which is now the ruling philosophic foundation of American education, secularism is a faith, and every secularist is a person of faith, including the most rabid atheist. You see, it takes faith to believe that nature created itself. It takes faith to believe that the earth is just the right distance from the sun, and it tilts just the right amount and contains just the right amount of oxygen in the atmosphere by pure chance. It takes faith to believe that man is the measure of all things. Well, John Dewey once wrote, "Never before in history has mankind been so much of two minds, so divided into two camps as it is today." Well, that sounds like America of right now, but actually it's the opening sentence from Dewey's book, A Common Faith, which was written in 1934. The division Dewey referred to was the split between people who think the advancement of culture and science has completely discredited the supernatural, and those who believe in a supernatural being, and, as he put it, an immortality that is beyond the power of nature. Well, as I've mentioned before, Dewey embraced materialism, which claims that matter is all that is, or was, or ever shall be. So when we die, we're done, period. Moral order is not prescribed from above, but it's created from among ourselves. Purpose is what human beings alone determine it to be. Yet, in A Common Faith, Dewey argues that materialists are religious. He says you don't have to believe in the supernatural to be religious. Now, Dewey signed the first Humanist Manifesto in 1933, which declares that the time has passed for a belief in theism. And it also says we consider the religious forms and ideas of our fathers no longer adequate. But Dewey was a religious devotee. He was committed to a different faith, a non-theistic, non-supernaturalistic faith. Now, Dewey admitted that understanding how a non-supernaturalist can be religious is difficult for many, but he went on to distinguish between a religious outlook and a particular religion. And he said it isn't necessary to subscribe to a supernaturalist religion to have a truly religious experience, to be a religious person, or to partake in religious functions of a supernaturalist faith. And he is right. Now, Dewey further said, faith in the continued disclosing of truth through directed, cooperative human endeavor is more religious in quality than any faith in a completed revelation. Think about that. Dewey was committed to the outworking of social pragmatism through education, which is a directed, cooperative human endeavor that continually disclosed truth apart from a completed revelation. So, goodbye, Comenius. Now, does it take faith to believe that nature is all that is or was or ever shall be? Does it take faith to believe morality is determined by human beings alone with no regard for any higher moral order than ourselves? Does it take faith to believe that all truth is equally true and all cultures are equally good? Well, does it rain in Seattle? Now, as I've mentioned before, Dewey's faith brings up sticky questions with respect to the practice of faith in public schools. While it may be possible to separate church from public school, is it possible to separate faith from public school? Actually, it isn't. G.K. Chesterton said, "In truth, there are only two kinds of people, those who accept dogma and know it, and those who accept dogma and don't know it." Well, with the faith of postmodern secularism comes a number of hard and fast dogmas, such as the dogma that one person's concept of truth is just as valid as another person's concept of truth, and the dogma that says tolerance is the highest virtue a person can possess. Tolerance of any view except an intolerant one, that is. And the dogma of what I call radical whateverism, which says there's no such thing as bad culture, just different culture. But is all culture equally good? Really? Was the culture of Nazi Germany just as good as any other? Think about that. Well, how did the thinking of so many Americans on the street, how did it change? How did we get from Comenius and Webster to where we are today? And more importantly, is a course correction even possible? Well, we've touched on some of the turning factors in previous lectures. Certainly the takeover of Harvard by Unitarians in 1805 had a lot to do with the turning of the so-called elite schools of higher education in this country. We've also seen the influence of professors like William James at Harvard and his Darwinized view of truth, and John Dewey's view of education at Columbia as a means for social change. But it all came to a head in the 1960s when postmodernism really broke into the rank and file lives of citizens. So I want to talk a little bit about postmodernism. Well, what exactly is postmodernism? Well, for the average person, the word postmodern seemed to come out of nowhere in the latter part of the 20th century. Arnold Toynbee used the word back in 1954 to describe Western civilization's decline into irrationality and relativism. But the term postmodern really didn't seem to crystallize until about the mid-70s or so. In fact, culture watchers were still trying to define it in the 90s. To wrap our minds around the word postmodern, it really helps to start with the word modern. That's because postmodernism, I think, is best understood as a reaction to modernism. So I'd like to briefly define what modernism is or was. The roots of modernism go back to the 17th century, to what's generally called the scientific revolution. The invention of the microscope and the telescope, as I've mentioned before, and the discoveries of Kepler and Galileo and Newton opened up new perspectives on the world and birthed different ways of seeing things and thinking about reality. Well, by the time of the so-called Enlightenment in the 18th century, modernism was really in high gear. Well, that term Enlightenment denotes the idea that a new light had dawned on a dark west. And this new light was the light of independent reason, independent of divine revelation, that is. Now, we talked about this at length in session 8 when we talked about Descartes. Descartes' brand of reason was a kind of reason that was based upon that which could be proven through scientific rationalism and empiric evidence. It was a form of reason that elevated the third book of Comenius's 3 books to dominance and reduced the first book, the Bible, to irrelevance. Now, with the Enlightenment, a very different approach to determining truth and reality emerged. The 5 senses of sight, touch, taste, sound, and smell alone govern one's concept of what was really real and really true. Now, eventually, over a couple of hundred years or so, scientific rationalism became the dominant guiding light of the culture shapers like William James and John Dewey and others. God, miracles, and the supernatural were all relegated to the realm of folklore, or to a very private and personal sphere generally thought of as supernaturalistic religion. Well, during the modern era, optimism steadily grew with the scientific rationalistic approach, because it was believed that through scientific rationalism, eventually every problem known to man could and would be solved. You see, modernity had arrived, and with it the hope of a utopian society. Science would solve all problems, given enough time. Modernity also brought with it the idea that humans could discover universal truths that apply to everyone, through scientific rationalism and empirical evidence. You see, the modernists, they didn't throw away the idea that universal absolute truth existed. They just sought to discover it through a different means than Luther, Comenius, and Webster. Well, here are a few basic contrasts between modernism and postmodernism. Modernism assumes that reason is the ultimate authority and the guiding light. Postmodernism assumes that reason is not the ultimate guiding light and the final authority. In postmodernism, personal opinion, intuition, even gut instinct can be valid. Modernism assumes that universal truths can be discovered through observation and measurement, guided by scientific rationalism and human reason. But postmodernism assumes there's no such thing as objective, certain, or universal truth. You see, truth to the postmodern mind is a construct. It's determined by different social groups, and it varies from group to group. In modernism, the standard center of meaning and values for humanity is humanity. While in postmodernism, there is no standard center of meaning and values for all. Now, the 2 things happened in the 20th century to bring about these changes in core beliefs. One thing was the development of quantum physics in the 1920s. Now, quantum physics, or quantum mechanics, is the study of the minuscule elements of atoms, like protons, electrons, neutrons, and quarks. This subatomic world is a much different place than most of us can even imagine. In the Newtonian world of physics, laws of cause and effect are consistent. They're universal and they're absolute. That is, they work every time, everywhere in the universe. And scientists still use Newton's laws to successfully send probes to planets in outer space. But scientists in the 1920s found that the subatomic world didn't operate by consistent universal absolute laws of cause and effect. At least no laws that they could discern. Gravity was virtually a non-factor, and things just didn't happen in the subatomic micro level like they did in the world of mid-scale phenomena, that is, the realm of everyday human experience where we generally live. Quantum physicists carried out experiments with subatomic matter that had different outcomes at different times. And this introduced a measure of uncertainty into a field of knowledge, physics, that had for several hundred years been governed by certainty. Uncertainty now became a principle all its own and a new premise for how things worked, at least at the subatomic realm. So in the subatomic world, laws just didn't apply like they did elsewhere. So predictions of how things would happen at the subatomic level were considered to be probable but not certain. And to make things even more interesting, matter at the subatomic level was perceived to be acting in different ways depending on how the observer observed it. All things become very, very strange when some quantum physicists tell us that there are multi-level dimensions of reality. Now, I'm not going to say it isn't true. Who am I to say? I'm not a physicist. And I see no biblical reason to reject the theories of quantum physics. The theories themselves aren't anti-biblical per se. They don't contradict the function of a purposeful and orderly creator as I see it. But the problem comes when people take the theories of quantum mechanics and they extrapolate them to apply to other areas of life, to fields that are really far removed from physics, such as philosophy and law and ethics. Now, some 20th century thinkers and culture shapers began to use quantum physics as a popular argument for the idea that truth itself was not absolute. It wasn't universal or certain. Truth depended on how the observer observed it. Truth, in this scheme of things, is what the individual perceived it to be, or maybe I should say what the individual wanted it to be. Well, another big development in the 20th century that really caused modernism to lose its grip on Western culture was a general disillusionment with reason and with science itself because of what it actually produced. You see, the age of reason and the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, they were all supposed to lead to the solving of all problems, and utopia was just over the horizon. But what actually happened in the 20th century really proved quite the opposite. World War I was really terrible, and it was said to be the war to end all wars. But World War II came right behind it virtually, and World War II really was more horrific than World War I in that it ended with the dropping of 2 atomic bombs on 2 Japanese cities that killed about 110,000 people instantly, and about 350,000 by 1950 through the slow effects of radiation. And then following World War II, we witnessed the mass murder of millions in the name of ideologies. An estimated 170 million people were killed in the 20th century at the hands of their own governments. On top of this, the toxic byproducts of the Industrial Revolution really came into full bloom. And 20th century consumerism produced a level of pollution that the world had never seen. And by the 1960s, things came to a head. The fruit of about 300 years of unbridled, autonomous reason, divorced from revelation, had brought the human race to what seemed like the eve of destruction, to quote one of the popular songs of the 60s. Well, in the 1960s, a worldwide intellectual revolt took place, particularly among young people who declared that they couldn't trust anyone over the age of 30. Now, if reason had led us to the point where we were, they surmised, perhaps we better rethink reason. And rethink it they did, even to the point of rejecting reason itself, and some of them turning to Eastern religions for alternatives. Now, although postmodernism didn't begin in the 60s, the 60s just seemed to catapult it out into the mainstream of American culture. Modern optimism turned into postmodern cynicism. Belief in progress turned into a sense of regress. A different way of seeing things took shape, what you might call the postmodern way, although we didn't know what to call it until much later. But that's precisely what Kathy and I witnessed on the streets of Seattle when we asked people to define right and wrong. That is postmodern thought. In rejecting modernism, people began to embrace the idea that human reason was not the ultimate guiding light and the final authority. Nowadays, as I said, personal opinion and intuition or gut instinct can be just as valid. Like the man on the street said, if your body tingles, if it tells you it's wrong, it's wrong. And by the way, that particular person was on the streets for the purpose of collecting signatures because he was running or wanting to run for the office of city mayor. Now, in the postmodern world, truth is a mental construct. It's determined by different social groups, and so it varies from group to group. All truths are equally valid. Various truths that seem to conflict with one another, they don't really conflict because, according to the postmodern mentality, truth is multidimensional. It's kind of like the multidimensions of quantum physics. So trying to convince neighbors or coworkers that Christianity is true can sometimes be an exercise in futility. Our knowledge of biblical apologetics might not mean a lot to certain people with a postmodern mind. In fact, they might say, well, of course Christianity is true. It's just as true as Hinduism and atheism. So you see, it's all true. Now, it is possible for someone to say to a follower of Christ today, I'm glad you found the truth for you. And in the same breath they might add, but don't impose your truth on me. This is one of the hard and fast dogmas of the postmodern world. You can't impose your truth on others. It's really been interesting over the years to watch the change in the meaning of the word tolerance. Well, when I was a child in the 50s, tolerance meant that you allowed other people to believe what they believed to be true, even if it was false, without forcing them to change their minds. But today it means that you accept that what other people believe to be true is true and just as true as what you believe is true. And if you don't accept their truth as being just as valid as your truth, you are labeled intolerant. And today we're expected to celebrate other concepts of truth. And if we don't, we're branded as bigots. Today, Christians who hold to the idea of absolute truth, that is universally true for everyone, those kinds of people are seen as imposing their construct of truth on others. And in doing so, Christians are seen as oppressors. Now, in the postmodern culture, to suggest that there's only one transcendent moral order that applies to everybody, or there's one truth for all, or one way to come to the knowledge of that truth, well, all of that is, it's just not tolerated. Now, the practical outcome of postmodernism in our society is that there's no longer a unifying center of values and ethics for everyone. There's no longer a shared commonality when it comes to values. Values are clarified by individuals or tribes, as they're called. So what's right for one tribe must not be construed as right for all tribes. And as a result, no tribe is wrong. And in a certain sense, nobody's wrong anymore, except, ironically, it's wrong to say something is wrong. Now, the ramifications for all this for our culture at large really are enormous. And we are currently living in a divided culture. It's true that divided we fall. And the future of our culture doesn't look real encouraging. There's no longer a commonly held standard which everyone recognizes as the standard, even though individuals might not live up to it, and a lot of individuals may not subscribe to it. In the former days, the Bible really did provide a commonality for American citizens. Again, they weren't all believers, but it was commonly accepted that this was our standard for moral issues. Now, this isn't just my opinion or the opinion of a few Christian historians. I'd like to point out to you the late Alan Bloom, who, by the way, was not a Christian, and he wrote his critically acclaimed book back in the 80s called The Closing of the American Mind. Bloom taught philosophy at places like Cornell University and the University of Toronto and Yale University and the University of Chicago. And in his book, he wrote the following really remarkable words. He said this: "In the United States, practically speaking, the Bible was the only common culture, one that united the simple and the sophisticated, rich and poor, young and old, and as the very model for a vision of the order of the whole of things, as well as the key to the rest of Western art, the greatest works of which were in one way or another responsive to the Bible, provided access to the seriousness of books. With its gradual and inevitable disappearance, the very idea of such a total book is disappearing, and fathers and mothers have lost the idea that the highest aspirations they might have for their children is for them to be wise, as priests, prophets, or philosophers are wise. Specialized competence and success are all that they can imagine. Contrary to what is commonly thought, without the book, even the idea of the whole is lost." Wow. Alan Bloom wasn't some Christian school aficionado trying to sell the idea of Christian schools to the public. But I would really be hard-pressed to come up with one paragraph that explains the current problem with mainstream American education and the need for biblically holistic education than the paragraph I just read. Now, our culture has lost the very idea of the whole of things. And as Bloom said, without the book, the Bible, the idea of the whole is lost. So, the question is, can the idea of the whole be restored? Well, that's the challenge addressed by this course, and that, I believe, is why followers of Christ are needed in the field of education, both in Christian as well as public schools. I do not believe it's too late to make a course adjustment. If we look at the history of ancient Israel, we see that they went through times of nearly unbelievable apostasy. And when Israel followed after God, they were blessed. But at other times, they were lured towards the false gods of the surrounding nations. And at one point, they even sacrificed their children to false gods. Foreign enemies defeated them, but in God's love and mercy, he pursued them. And when they repented, turning once again to the Lord, God healed them and their land. Now, as Vishal Mangalwadi says in his book, The Book That Made Your World, the sun need not set on the west. Europe and America can be revived again. Light can shine on nations that have been confused and misled by Western universities and media. Well, this is the hope, and this is the cause I'm enlisting your help in. If you're a Christian educator, whether it's in the classroom or the sanctuary or a household, as Christian educators, we can play and must play a critical role in affecting a course change. But to do this, I believe we really must be strategic, we must be intentional, we must be skillful and very winsome, wise as serpents and harmless as doves. In the 1600s, during the initial wave of the Reformation, people like John Comenius and William Ames, they really brought meaning to education. They brought meaning to education as a way to glorify God in the earth through every human endeavor via vocations. The center of meaning for education was found in the transcendent God and His will being done in the world of matter. Now, in the modern era that followed, in the 18th and 19th century, the center of meaning shifted from that transcendent God to man. And in the 21st century now, there's no standard center of meaning other than what a particular group or tribe determines it to be for themselves. Now, the consequences of not effectively and skillfully assimilating biblical truth into the learning experiences of the next generation, I believe, are enormously serious, both for individuals as well as for our entire culture. We've seen how the removal of this truth assimilation has really affected our society over the past 150 years. And if there ever was a time to reassimilate the biblical worldview into learning, academics, and the whole experience of school, and to demonstrate how the biblical worldview connects to all of life, if there's ever been a time to do that, it's now. Now, I'm not suggesting that we try to reclaim the culture through some kind of top-down political legislation, although I do think Christian involvement in politics is vitally important. That's part of the holistic approach to life. But we've got to get to the heart of the matter. For those of you who are involved in Christian schools, let's work to improve our schools through a concerted and intentional move toward the kind of biblical truth assimilation that John Comenius and William Ames had in mind. We do need to take a long look at this matter of biblical truth assimilation within all academic subjects. And as you know from taking this course, it's not a matter of opening class with prayer or inserting a Bible verse here and there or having the kids go to chapel once a week. It's a matter of true biblical truth assimilation throughout the entire academic curriculum and the extracurricular activities that are provided by the school. I suggest we take seriously the kind of integration that the Technologia provided for early American Christians. Now, I'm not saying we go back and use old books, but I am suggesting that we reclaim the basic philosophy of that approach to the three books of God's Word, God's works, and yes, human reason. It worked extremely well for 150 years in this country, and I believe that principle can work extremely well again. And let's return to the basic premise that authentic education is about instilling virtue, not just academic excellence, memorized facts or specialized skills. But let's understand that it's not just virtue for virtue's sake, but it's virtue for vocation's sake. This is how Milton and Comenius saw it, where a person's shop as well as his chapel are both holy ground. This was the holistic approach to life and to learning, whether it was learning in the school, the church, or the home. So let's press toward recapturing the seminal idea of the integrationists, that education is about discovering what God has created, then imitating him through additional creation as image bearers of God, responding to the first commission to govern over matter, working always before the face of God, coram Deo, and in this process to bring glory back to God. This includes restoring, I believe, restoring a robust theology of work to the K-12 curriculum, not as a separate subject, but as an integrative element through the K-12 years, as we've discussed. All of this moves us, as Nancy Pearcey put it, beyond criticizing culture to creating culture. And in the process, we're inspiring young minds to engage in something grand, beyond themselves, yet in the here and now. And that, I believe, is what holistic Christian education is about. Now, let me share with you a way that we can encourage and communicate with one another after this course is over. And that is through the internet. Now, I mentioned in session 11 that I had the privilege of spending a week with Darrell Miller and 6 other men from around the country and from South America. We were discussing the content of Darrell's book, Life Work, and the ramifications of it all. And during that week together, I learned more about what Darrell's organization, Disciple Nations Alliance, was doing to promote a holistic vision for vocation. And I looked more into their website called Monday Church. And you know about that website because you've already been to it. Well, I mentioned to Darrell that it really would be helpful if there was a way for educators from around the world who are committed to biblically holistic education to participate in some kind of online community, a community of like-minded teachers and administrators for mutual encouragement, for sharing of ideas and stories. And Darrell really agreed this would be a good idea. And he asked me if I'd be willing to moderate such an online endeavor, and I said I would. And within a few months, an online group was created called Turning Learning, a meeting place for Christian educators. Now, we decided that rather than create a new delivery mechanism for this group, that we would just use one of the common mechanisms that's already used, namely Facebook. Now, the Turning Learning Facebook group, it's a private group, which means people wanting to participate need to be approved by the group moderator for access. But I heartily encourage each of you going through this course to become a member of the Turning Learning group. And if you know of colleagues that would be interested, encourage them to join as well. Now, although we urge members to take the Increased Meaning course and to read Life Work and Assumptions that Affect Our Lives, you don't have to be a part of this group. And we would encourage you to get the word out. Now, the way to become part of the Turning Learning group is to just type in facebook.com/groups/Turning Learning. Type that into the address bar of any internet browser, and this will take you to a page that looks something like this. And you'll see a message indicating that the group is private, and you simply request access by clicking Join Group. And this will send a message probably to me as the group moderator, and I'll approve it. And you'll get a message back informing you of your acceptance into the group. Now, once you get into the Turning Learning main page, you'll see a tab that explains what the goal of the group is, which I think is worth reading here. It says the goal of this group is to be a catalyst for major reform of education through a biblically holistic approach that dispenses with sacred secular dualism and creates culture that is in alignment with Christ. Another tab says events. Now, this would be where we would post training classes that are happening in certain parts of the country, or perhaps announcing a worldwide Skype conference call on certain topics or things like that. Another tab says photos, and this would include video clips and whatnot. Then there's the Files tab, and in this area you'll find teaching tools and helpful articles. Now, because educators are a wide variety of types, from preschool teachers to college professors, we encourage subgroups to be formed with a particular topic of conversation. For example, if you're a preschool director and you want to communicate with other preschool directors about biblically holistic education at the preschool level, you can start a group or request a group be started called Turning Learning Preschool Directors. I really urge all of you to connect with this online community. Not only will it help you to stay focused, but your ideas can encourage many others. Now, for those of you who are administrators, I urge you to have your school go through the certification program of Worldview Matters and to become a member of the International Coalition of Truth Assimilating Schools. Worldview Matters offers a certified program in the art and science of biblical truth assimilation. Now, this program involves the training of staff members and the one-on-one coaching of the headmaster and the staff training supervisors. And I'll be happy to walk you through that. It's a 3 to 5 year process. It's customized to fit your school's needs and your desires and your budget. So if you're interested in that, send me an email at overman@biblicalworldview.com and ask for information about the Worldview Matters certification program, and someone will get back to you very soon. Now, to conclude this course, I'd like to show you a short conversation I had with Os Guinness, the author of many excellent books, including one called The Call. Os Guinness is one of the most respected and prolific voices in our generation, specifically with respect to articulating a distinctly biblical approach to culture. And I think that hearing from Os Guinness is a very fitting way to wrap up this course. Well, let me say it has been a great privilege to be your instructor, and I pray that your continuing efforts as a Christian educator will really bear much fruit. God bless you. Os Guinness was born in China, the son of medical missionaries, and he has written 30 books. Most of his books have to do with the intersection between Christianity and culture. And we're blessed today to have him share with you a little bit about his book, The Call. In chapter 1 of your book, you say that you've written several books during the last 25 years, and you say that no book burned within you longer or more fiercely than this one. That's pretty passionate language. Why did this book burn so long in you, and why so fiercely?
Well, the whole notion of calling means everything to me in two senses. First, it was the key to my own discovery of what I believe the Lord wants me to do with my life. And secondly, I believe it is the truth which challenges Christians to integrate their faith in a way that helps them engage with the modern world. And so it's one of the truths, it's a key to the rediscovery of the integrity and effectiveness of faith today. Or another way of putting it is this: probably second only to the cross, calling has put its stamp on history and culture in a proven way. And if we find it again today, it will make an incredible difference.
How has it put its stamp on history in a proven way? What are you thinking of when you make that statement?
Well, when I say that, the Reformation is one of the greatest movements of ideas in Western history by any standards. And one of the truths at the heart of the Reformation was calling. So if you read, say, Martin Luther's Babylonian Captivity, it's not about calling, it's about the sacraments. But on one page, he talks about the faith of someone out in the fields, a farmer or his wife. If they have faith and a sense of calling, it will integrate the whole of their lives in an extraordinary way. And Luther says that is just as high and holy as the pastor in the pulpit. Now, when that paragraph, it was almost just a paragraph, was discovered. It made an incredible impact across Europe, almost instantly. And the same can happen today.
What was the impact?
Well, it affected the rise of the dignity of work, so that a laborer, a peasant, a farmer, his or her work was just as important to God and to them as, say, being a priest. It affected democracy. It was everyone, not just the elite. And certainly it affected the way that faith was challenged to be integrated with the whole of culture. It came out of the closet, as it were, and touched the whole of culture.
How did we lose the Reformers' holistic understanding of calling? And how do we recover it?
Now you can see that around the 3rd century, under a gentleman called Eusebius of Caesarea, the bishop, he had the notion that Christian life had 2 characters, and this is his words, perfect and permitted. So the perfect life is spiritual for the elite, the monks, the nuns, the priests. The permitted is for lay people. Farmers, lawyers, soldiers, and so on. People are going to have children. So you have a 2-tier universe, full-time, part-time, spiritual, secular, and so on. And that notion goes right through the Catholic ages. And that's what Martin Luther shatters. Now, the Reformation had extraordinary impact on Northern Europe, on Germany, England, Holland, Switzerland, and so on. And you can see the Northern European countries, it gave a link to capitalism, democracy, and certainly to the profound influence of faith. But then with the rise of things like pietism, which was originally wonderful, the dualism crept back in today. So you can see the irony is that, say, John Paul II, the Catholic Pope, he is closer to Martin Luther than many evangelicals are. Because we've got notions like full-time Christian service. What are other people? Part-time followers of Jesus? Nonsense. But you can see that dualism has crept back into evangelical circles again and needs to be rooted out.
How do we root it out?
Well, above all, through good teaching. We've really got to teach the word simply and practically, but apply it constantly. In other words, you say, is Jesus Lord of everything? Of course. He is Lord. We sing with deep and sincere devotion. But Christians don't realize they move out into the world, and the world tends to fragment us. So faith flourishes at home, one hopes. In the church, one hopes. But how about work and all the other spheres of life? Because the modern world is characterized by what's called differentiation. Different ways of thinking, different ways of working. And so without realizing it, people, well, you don't wear hats now, but you tend to hang your hat and your coat at the door and your faith along with it. And so faith becomes fragmented rather than integrated.
You say in your book that you were urged on all sides to become a minister or a missionary. And you go on to say that coming to understand calling set your feet on a different path. And you said that you felt liberated by that understanding. What was the most personally liberating aspect of your understanding of calling?
I followed Jesus for more than 50 years now. But when I came to Christ, it was almost taught explicitly, it was certainly implicit, that if you were really dedicated, you were a minister, a missionary, or an evangelist. Wasn't quite said that bluntly, but almost. And many years later, when I'd been liberated from that, I talked to John Stott, who was a great friend, and he said that was true of him when he'd come to Christ 20 or so years earlier. Now, my parents are missionaries. I knew I wasn't cut out for that. I actually had a rather comic attempt at being an evangelist, which is another story. And then I went, with those two knocked out, to see if I was a minister. And I worked for 9 months in a church. And to be honest, I loved the people. And it was a privilege to preach and so on occasionally, but I hated it. And one day, I had then a 40-year-old car. It was 1927 Austin. And you had to crank it in the front. And I took it to the only garage where you get gas and tension, and those days you didn't have self-service. So, and I talked for about 20 minutes to the man who fill the tank and so on. Got back in the car and I realized that was the first non-Christian I'd spoken to in a couple of weeks. And I thought, that's why I don't like the ministry. It's a womb-to-tomb subculture. And I love engaging with the world. And articulating this to a friend, he said, you ought to read William Perkins. And he gave me a Xerox copy of the 16th century book, which was a treatise on calling. And it was liberating to me. We all had different callings, different gifts, and calling means to follow God's call to us in line with our own particular gifts. And I'm not cut out to be a minister. And so I was incredibly liberated. About 4 years later, after I'd been at L'Abri, I was actually invited to be the minister of Westminster Chapel, which was Martin Lloyd-Jones's old church.
Yes, I've been there.
And I was horrified, the thought that the Lord might be calling me to that. And I wasn't quite clear in my mind at that stage. And I wrestled and sweated over a weekend and finally said to them, no, I didn't believe that was my calling. And since then, it's just been liberation. So someone like John Stott, who was called to the ministry, he was gifted to be a minister. That was his calling. I'm not. And so the thing is for each of us to discover that which is us. Do what you are.
Yes, yes. How does a holistic understanding of calling transform culture?
The fact is that a lot of Christian faith today is not integrated. As I put it, the problem is not we aren't where we should be. The problem is that we're not what we should be where we are. So the number of Christians who've really thought through what it means to be a follower of Jesus in whatever their profession is or their job is are rather few. Now I have a friend. You can do this at certain levels of business. I have a friend who owns a large automotive business. And he's thought through everything from the pricing of cars to the dealing of clients to the marketing and so on. He's thought through everything Christianly. Now, of course, he can do that because he owns the company. And people higher up, say in a public company, don't have the freedom to do that. And people who are just working for someone else don't have the freedom to do that. But to the level we have freedom, we need to think through what it means, how we deal with our colleagues, how we stand up for integrity and honesty. Think through everything we do in the light of Christ. And that's what it means to be salt and light. And the trouble at the moment, many Christians are not salty and light-bearing.
In chapter 7, which you call A Time to Stand, you say that some Christians prefer to keep their faith to the level of the personal, the relational, the spiritual, and the simple. And then you say that you believe that such a view of faith is misguided. You say that calling really is a truth that touches our personal lives intimately, but it also touches cultural life potently. And you say that calling is more than purely cultural, but it's also more than purely personal. And you say that to discover the meaning of calling is to discover the heart of the gospel itself. What is the heart of the gospel?
If we go back to the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all begin with the announcement of the kingdom, obviously through the coming of the King, Jesus himself. So we're not called as followers of Jesus to believe 7 doctrines or 10 doctrines or 12. Jesus doesn't talk like that. He announces the kingdom's arrival and the light. Those who are living in the kingdom live a certain way of life. We love our enemies and do lots of other tough things like that. So we've got to see that we're called into a kingdom to live a way of life. And that's what calling really means. And you can see all the distortions of it over the centuries. So certainly we stand for truth. Doctrine, truth matters. But we're not called to believe 10 doctrines, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and check them off and see if we're orthodox. We're called to follow him and to lead a way of life.
Yes.
And that's why we've got to get back to the whole biblical essence of what this is about.
You say in your book that your challenge is deliberate. you remind the reader that many followers of Jesus haven't really begun to wrestle with the full dimensions of the truth of calling because we haven't been stretched by the real challenges of today's world and by what you call the momentousness of the present hour. Well, those are really powerful words. What did you have in mind when you wrote those words, the momentousness of the present hour?
I believe we're living in an Augustinian moment. St. Augustine heard the reports of the sack of Rome by the Visigoths. In other words, his privilege and his task was to live at the end of 800 years of Roman dominance. And what's amazing is the Christians of his time, after the Emperor Theodosius declared Rome Christian, they identified the church and Rome. And as Rome spreads, the church would spread. So when Rome collapsed, the church would collapse. And Augustine, thank God, said, no, the city of God is not the city of man. And his vision was a vision of faithfulness that was like a bridge through and across the Dark Ages into what many centuries later became Christendom. Now, in the same way, take three simple facts. The decline of the West. We're living at the end of 500 years of Western dominance. The global era, it's over. Secondly, let's be blunt, we're living in the era of the relative decline, if not the absolute decline, of the American Republic. This is not the second American century. Thirdly, we're living in an era of the profound cultural captivity of the church. Now, in the Western world, the church is exploding in the global South, but not in the West. Put those three together, our challenge, like Augustine, is to live with integrity and effectiveness, faithfulness, today. Now that means, on the one hand, going back to explore, are we as close to the gospel as we should be?
Yes.
And on the other hand, are we engaging with the full challenges of the modern world, intellectual, sociological, political, and so on, as we should be? And that double challenge is ours.
Well said. Thank you very much for allowing me to interview you. This has been enlightening and inspiring, and I think it will be for everyone who sees it. God bless you.
Thank you. My pleasure.